Liam sat at his heavy wooden desk in the great stone house on the hill, watching the last match burn down to a sliver of black ash. The fog from the Oregon coast was rolling in through the tall pine trees, pressing against the glass windows like a cold, gray hand. His hair was as white as fresh snow, and his skin had the pale, smooth look of carved marble, marks of the ancient blood that ran through his veins. He had lived in this quiet valley for 7 years, since taking his place at the head of his family estate, at the age of 21. Now, at 28 years old in the eyes of the world, he felt a deep, heavy fatigue that a long sleep could not fix. A letter lay open on the desk before him, sent by an old family friend who lived 3 towns away. The letter spoke of a young woman named Hazel, who lived at the edge of Silver Creek, a small farming town down in the valley. The writer claimed the girl was quiet, hard-working, and did not care for the loud parties of the city, making her a perfect choice for a man who needed a quiet life. Liam put the letter down with a slow sigh, his pale fingers resting on the paper. He had heard these same promises many times before about other daughters from wealthy families, and every single time, the words had been nothing but a beautiful lie. He remembered a woman from a wealthy estate who claimed to love the quiet woods, only to spend her time complaining about the dirt and asking for expensive silver jewelry. He remembered another who smiled sweetly whenever he looked her way, but treated the house servants like dirt when she thought he was out of the room. They did not see the man behind the pale skin or the white hair. They only saw his grand house, his boxes of gold coins, and the ancient title of king that gave him power over the valley. For 7 long years, he had been hunted by families who wanted his wealth, chased through elegant dining rooms by mothers who wanted a royal match for their daughters. He was tired of the game, so tired that he wanted to leave the valley entirely. He picked up the paper one last time and read the warning at the bottom, which begged him to see the girl at least once before making a decision. He stared into the dying fire, and a strange idea came to him. It was a risky plan, perhaps even a bit cruel, but it was the only way he could find the absolute truth. If he wanted to know what this woman was truly like, he had to see her when she thought no one important was watching. He knew that titles and wealth changed how people acted, turning every conversation into a stage performance where everyone played a part. He would not go to her farm as a king with a carriage and guards. He would go as an ordinary traveler with nothing to his name. The next morning, Liam stood in a small back room of his basement with his old servant, a gray-haired man who had served his father for 40 years. The old servant looked at him with sharp eyes, understanding exactly what his master wanted, without needing a long explanation. Liam asked for the simplest clothes in the house, something that a working man or a traveling writer might wear on the road. The servant dug into an old wooden chest and pulled out a thick coat of dark brown wool, a pair of heavy leather boots that had seen many miles, and a plain gray cap. The cap was large enough to pull down over his white hair, hiding the most obvious sign of his true nature from strangers. Liam put on the clothes, finding the wool a little rough against his neck, and tied his boots with steady hands. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a regular young man, someone who would be told to wait by the back door rather than sit at a formal dinner table. He took a small canvas bag containing 2 plain shirts, a comb, a razor, and 5 silver coins, leaving his gold watch and royal rings behind in the desk drawer. He saddled a quiet brown horse from the lower barn, avoiding the fast black horse that everyone in town recognized as his. By noon, he was riding down the muddy mountain trail toward the valley, the cool wind carrying the smell of wet dirt and pine needles. The road was quiet, and for the first time in 7 years, he felt a strange sense of peace as he let the horse walk at its own slow pace. The valley was green and damp, filled with the sound of rushing water from the nearby creek. As he neared the edge of the town, the trees cleared to reveal a large orchard of apple trees stretching across the low hills. The fruit was still small and green, hanging thick under the wet leaves. A low wooden fence ran along the edge of the property, and Liam could see a small farmhouse made of weathered gray wood sitting near the center of the land. He did not head toward the front porch where guests usually arrived. Instead, he guided his horse down a side lane toward a small red barn where a young boy was stacking wooden crates. Liam pulled his horse to a stop near the barn door and adjusted the gray cap to make sure his white hair was fully covered. He cleared his throat and spoke in a lower, slightly rougher voice than he used at home, trying to sound like a common traveler. He told the boy that his horse had a loose shoe on its back leg and asked if there was a place where the animal could rest for the night while he looked for a blacksmith. The boy stopped his work and looked up, wiping his forehead with a sleeve that was covered in dark dirt. The boy was about 12 years old, with bright blue eyes and a face covered in tiny freckles. He walked around the horse, looking closely at its back legs with a serious expression before shaking his head. He told Liam that the horse looked perfectly fine to him and that its shoes were tight against the hoof. Liam smiled slightly, realizing the boy was smarter than he looked, and lied by saying the pain only showed when the horse walked on hard stones. The boy shrugged his shoulders, accepting the explanation, and told him he could use the empty stall at the end of the barn. He mentioned that his sister Hazel was running the orchard while their father was away in the city, and she would not mind a traveler staying the night. Liam dismantled the heavy leather saddle from his horse and hung it carefully on the wooden rail outside the stall. The barn was cool and dark, filled with the dry smell of alfalfa hay and the sharp scent of old leather. He found a stiff brush in a corner box and began to work on the horse's back, his long movements steady and slow. He had not cleaned a horse himself since he was a young boy, before his father passed away and left him with the heavy duties of the crown. The simple physical work felt good to his arms, taking his mind away from the endless numbers and land disputes that usually filled his days. He was still working on the horse's coat when he heard soft footsteps on the dirt floor behind him. He turned around and saw a young woman standing in the wide doorway of the barn, the bright afternoon light outlining her figure. She was small, but her arms looked strong from hard work, and she wore a simple blue cotton dress covered by a stained white apron. Her sleeves were rolled up to her elbows, revealing skin that was tanned from long hours in the sun. Her hair was the color of dark honey, tied back in a loose bun with a few strands falling around her cheeks. She walked into the stall without asking for his name, her gray eyes looking straight at his hands with an expression of disapproval. She told him that he was holding the brush completely wrong and pressing too hard on the horse's left shoulder where the muscle was tight. Before Liam could answer, she stepped closer and took the brush directly out of his fingers. Her hand was warm, and the skin of her palm felt rough and calloused against his cool skin. She guided his hand down to the horse's neck, forcing him to feel a small, hard knot under the brown hair. She explained that the saddle had been sitting too far forward, causing the leather straps to pinch the animal's skin during the long ride down the mountain. She told him to brush around the sore spot instead of directly over it, and warned him to move the saddle back by the width of 2 fingers when he rode out the next day. Liam stared at her face, surprised by her directness and her complete lack of fear. She was not beautiful in the way the city ladies were, with their heavy makeup and perfect curls, but her face had an honest strength that drew his eyes. Her nose had a tiny bump near the center, and her lips were slightly chapped from the wind. She looked up from the horse and caught him staring, her gray eyes narrowing slightly as she handed the brush back to him. She asked if he was going to stand there all day like a statue, or if he was going to tell her his name, so she knew who was sleeping in her barn. Liam had prepared his story on the long ride down, and he told her his name was Logan, a simple clerk traveling north to deliver letters for a business owner. He said he had taken the mountain trail to save time, but had lost his way in the thick fog. Hazel listened to his words with a calm face, neither believing him entirely nor calling him a liar. She told him that the horse needed to rest its leg for at least 24 hours, meaning he would have to stay in the hayloft above the barn for the night. She explained that the main house was mostly closed up while her father was away trying to settle their accounts, and she could only offer him plain bread, cheese, and water from the yard pump. Liam thanked her, saying the loft would be more than enough for a weary traveler, and offered to pay her 2 silver coins for the trouble. She refused the money immediately, saying they did not charge people for sleeping in the hay, especially when their animal was hurting. Liam climbed the wooden ladder to the hayloft as the sun began to drop below the western mountains, turning the sky a deep shade of orange. He sat on a pile of fresh straw, eating the thick piece of yellow cheese and crust of brown bread the farm boy had brought him a few minutes earlier. The food was simple, but it tasted better than the rich meats served at his own table, perhaps because he had earned it by spending the afternoon clearing old spiderwebs from the barn corners. Through the small square window of the loft, he watched the shadows grow long across the dirt yard below. As the darkness deepened, he heard the sound of voices coming from the front gate of the property. He leaned closer to the window, his sharp vampire hearing picking up every word despite the distance. He saw Hazel standing near the fence, holding a small tin lantern that cast a weak yellow glow over her blue dress. A tall man in a heavy coat was standing on the other side of the gate, his horse hitched to the wooden post. The man's voice was loud and impatient, demanding that a payment be made before the end of the coming week. Hazel did not flinch or step back from the gate, keeping her voice steady and calm as she spoke to the angry visitor. She told him that her father would return from the city in 3 days with the money they owed for the winter seed. The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the quiet orchard, and said he had heard that same promise twice before. He warned her that if the silver was not in his hands by Friday afternoon, he would take 3 acres of their best land as payment for the debt. Hazel looked him in the eye and said her family had never broken a final promise, telling him to go home to his family and wait until the agreed day. The man grumbled a final threat before mounting his horse and riding away into the darkness, leaving Hazel alone by the gate. Liam watched her from the loft window as she stood perfectly still for several minutes, the lantern shaking slightly in her hand. She lifted her left hand and pressed it against her forehead, closing her eyes for a brief moment, as if she were holding back a deep wave of pain. Then she straightened her shoulders, blew out the lantern flame, and walked back toward the dark house without making a sound. Liam lay back against the straw, staring up at the dark wooden beams of the roof, while the night grew cold around him. He thought about the way she had handled the angry creditor, showing no weakness even though she was clearly frightened about losing her home. She had not cried or begged for mercy, choosing instead to stand her ground with nothing but her own dignity to protect her. It was a completely different sight from the city, where people wept over the smallest losses and used their tears to get what they wanted from others. He realized then that his mother's letter had not lied about the girl's character, though it had failed to mention her iron will. He woke up at 5 o'clock the next morning, just as the first gray light was breaking through the mountain mist. The air inside the barn was freezing, and he could see his own breath forming small white clouds in front of his face. He went down the ladder and used a heavy iron fork to clean the horse stalls, working quickly to warm his cold muscles. He had completed 3 stalls by the time the kitchen door opened, and Hazel came out into the yard, carrying an empty wooden bucket in her right hand. She stopped near the barn door when she saw the clean stalls, her gray eyes widening slightly in surprise before she looked at Liam. She told him that he did not need to perform such heavy work, as he was a guest and his horse was the one doing the resting. Liam leaned against the wooden fork and smiled, telling her that a man could not eat a person's food without doing something to earn his keep. She set her bucket down by the well pump and looked at his hands again, noticing that he did not have any blisters despite the rough wooden handle. She remarked that he worked remarkably fast for a man who claimed to spend his days writing letters and sitting at a desk in the city. Liam quickly covered his mistake by saying his father had owned a small livery stable in the south, where he had been forced to work every morning before his school lessons began. Hazel gave a short nod, a sound that seemed to mean she was saving that piece of information for later consideration. She asked him if he knew how to repair a broken wooden gate, explaining that the wild deer had knocked down a section of the orchard fence during the night. They spent the next 3 hours working side by side, under the shade of the old apple trees, fixing the broken rails with thick iron nails. Liam held the heavy pine post steady, while Hazel swung the iron hammer, her movements accurate and powerful. He He watched the way her mouth tightened whenever she swung the tool, her dark honey hair coming loose from its bun and blowing across her damp forehead. The wind carried the scent of crushed green grass, wet earth, and the faint smell of lavender soap that seemed to follow her wherever she went. When the work was finished, they sat down on a low stone wall at the edge of the trees to rest their tired legs. Hazel pulled a small loaf of fresh bread and a piece of cold salted pork from her apron pocket, dividing the food equally between them. Liam took a bite of the bread, which was still warm from the kitchen oven, and found it sweeter than anything his royal cooks had ever prepared. He looked at her small profile as she chewed her food, wanting to ask her why she carried such a heavy burden alone without complaining about her father's absence. He kept his voice casual as he asked her if she ever wished to leave the small town and see the grand houses of the big city. Hazel looked out over the long rows of green trees, her fingers twisting a piece of dry grass between them. She said her father had spoken to her about a wealthy estate on the mountain, owned by a mysterious man with white hair who was looking for a wife. She laughed a little, a soft and rare sound that made Liam's chest feel strangely tight, and said the man was likely a cold monster who only wanted a woman to sit in his dark rooms and look pretty. She turned her gray eyes toward him, looking directly into his face, with an expression that made him want to pull his cap down even lower. She told him to look at her rough hands, her sunburnt face, and her crooked nose, asking why a rich king would ever choose a girl who smelled like horse sweat and apple dirt. She said she would rather lose the orchard and work as a maid in a city tavern than marry a man she did not know just to save her family from poverty. Liam could not find any words to answer her, his throat feeling dry as he realized how deeply she despised the title he carried. The following afternoon, Liam walked down the narrow dirt road into the center of Silver Creek, intending to buy a new leather strap for his horse's bridle. The town was small, consisting of a single main street lined with a blacksmith shop, a small dry goods store, and a crowded wooden tavern. The air inside the tavern was thick with the smell of cheap tobacco smoke and sour beer, as Liam stepped inside to escape a sudden downpour of rain. He sat down at a quiet corner table, keeping his hat low over his eyes, as he ordered a glass of cold apple cider from the young girl behind the counter. He had been sitting there for less than 10 minutes when two people entered the tavern and took a table 3 feet away from his position. One of them was a man wearing a bright green wool coat with polished silver buttons, his black hair combed back with sweet-smelling oil. He was accompanied by a woman wearing a large hat with red feathers, who held a delicate silk fan in her pale fingers, despite the coolness of the room. Liam recognized the man from the descriptions his advisors had given him of a distant cousin named Miles, who had been trying to buy land in the valley for several years. Miles ordered a bottle of expensive whiskey from the innkeeper, speaking in a loud, arrogant voice that showed he considered himself above the local townspeople. He turned to the woman beside him and laughed, saying that his old uncle would return from the city in 2 days with no money left in his pockets. He explained that he had secretly bought up all of the orchard's old debts from the city banks, meaning he now held the legal power to take the land whenever he pleased. He planned to force Hazel into a marriage by offering to clear the debt in exchange for her hand, knowing she would do anything to save her father from prison. The woman with the feathers smiled, asking what he planned to do with a poor farm girl who did not know how to behave in polite society. Miles leaned closer to the table, his eyes shining with greed as he explained his true plan for the property. He said there was a narrow strip of land along the western edge of the orchard that controlled the only access to the mountain river. He knew the white-haired king on the hill had been trying to buy that specific piece of land for 3 years to build a water mill for his tenants. Once the marriage was legal, Miles would sell the strip to the king for 5 times its actual value, making himself rich enough to move away to the coast. Liam sat perfectly still in his dark corner, his hand gripping the glass of cider so hard that the thick glass began to crack under his fingers. The cider tasted like vinegar in his mouth now, his anger burning hot and dangerous beneath his pale skin. He realized that his own search for a wife had been used by his corrupt cousin as a tool to destroy an innocent family. He paid for his drink with a single silver coin and walked out of the tavern into the pouring rain, his mind filled with the image of Hazel, standing alone by her wooden gate in the dark. He walked back along the muddy lane toward the orchard, his boots sinking deep into the wet earth with every step he took. The rain had stopped by the time he reached the farm, leaving the air smelling of wet pine needles and cold mud. He felt a deep sense of shame for the lie he was living, knowing that he had allowed this woman to trust him while his name was being used to trap her. He knew he had no legal right to interfere in her family's business, but the thought of Miles forcing her into a marriage made his blood turn to ice. That evening, Liam did not go up to the hayloft after finishing his supper of dried beef and cold water. He stood in the dark shadow of the big barn door, watching the kitchen windows of the farmhouse until the yellow lamplight was extinguished. A few minutes later, Hazel came out into the yard wearing a thick wool shawl over her blue dress, her dark honey hair hanging loose down her back. She carried her tin lantern in her left hand, its light casting long, dancing shadows across the damp dirt of the yard. She stopped short when she noticed him standing in the darkness, her hand moving instinctively to tighten the shawl around her throat. She asked him why he was not asleep in the loft, noting that the wind was turning cold and the midnight fog was starting to roll in from the woods. Liam stepped out into the weak light of her lantern, his face serious and his voice low as he asked her to listen to him for a moment. She looked at his expression, seeing something in his eyes that made her set the lantern down on the stone well wall and fold her arms across her chest. He told her that he had been in the town tavern during the rainstorm and had overheard her cousin Miles speaking to a woman about her father's debts. He explained carefully how Miles had bought up the old banknotes and was planning to use them to force her into a marriage when her father returned. He did not mention his own identity yet, keeping his voice flat, as he described how Miles planned to sell the western strip of her land to the king on the hill for a massive profit. Hazel listened to the story without interrupting him once, her body becoming as stiff and still as a stone statue. The only sound in the yard was the distant hooting of an owl in the pine woods and the soft creaking of the wooden sign by the road. When he finished speaking, she looked down at her boots for a long minute, her fingers twisting the edge of her woolen shawl. She asked him why a stranger who had arrived 3 days ago would care enough to warn her about a family trap. Liam stepped a bit closer, the smell of her lavender soap and the sweet scent of the apple trees filling his senses in the dark air. He told her that he was warning her because she had given a tired traveler a place to sleep when she had no reason to trust him. He said that a woman who worked until her hands were bleeding to save her family deserved to know when someone was trying to steal her future. Hazel looked up at him, her gray eyes glistening slightly in the lantern light, though her mouth remained set in a firm line. She thanked him for the warning, her voice shaking just a little before she mastered it, and asked him to come into the kitchen where they could sit by the fire. The kitchen was small and warm, smelling of old wood smoke and the sweet apple pies she had baked earlier in the week. A large gray cat was sleeping in a woven basket by the hearth, opening one eye to look at Liam before returning to sleep. Hazel filled 2 clay mugs with hot tea from an iron kettle, sitting down opposite him at the long wooden table. She confessed that she had known about the missing money but had not realized her cousin had gone so far to destroy them. She asked Liam what a simple clerk would do if he were in her position, faced with the choice between a cold king and a greedy thief. Liam looked down at the dark tea in his mug, watching the steam rise up into the cool air of the kitchen room. He told her that if he were in her place, he would never marry a man like Miles, even if it meant giving up the land and the house. He said that a home could be rebuilt in another town, but a life spent with a man who bought his wife like a farm animal would be a prison that no amount of silver could open. Hazel watched his face as he spoke, her gray eyes reflecting the small orange flames from the fireplace hearth. He continued by saying that she should at least meet the king on the hill before she decided that he was a cold monster. He suggested that people in power were often surrounded by rumors started by those who wanted their money, and the true man might be different from the gossip. Hazel leaned her elbows on the wooden table, looking closely at his pale skin and the way his hands remained steady on the clay mug. She asked him once more who he truly was, saying that no common clerk from the city spoke with such authority or had such clean, unblemished skin. Liam felt a sharp pang of guilt in his chest as he looked at her honest face, knowing that the time for his disguise had come to an end. He told her that he was indeed a man who had lied to her about his employment, but promised to tell her the entire truth the following morning, after he had settled the matter with Miles. Hazel did not push him for more answers, merely nodding her head as she rose from the table to clear the empty mugs. They said a quiet good night to each other across the dark kitchen room, the space between them feeling heavier than it had before. He woke up before dawn the next day, leaving his horse in the barn as he walked down the foggy road toward the eastern edge of the property. He knew from the tavern conversation that Miles would be riding from the town to the orchard at 7 o'clock to present his demands to Hazel's father. Liam waited under the deep shadow of a massive oak tree, where the road narrowed between two high stone banks. The morning mist was thick, turning the green pine trees into gray shapes that looked like ghosts in the early light. At exactly 7 o'clock, the sound of horse hooves echoed down the road, and Miles appeared through the fog, riding a fine black mare. Liam stepped out from under the tree branches, standing directly in the center of the narrow dirt path, with his arms hanging loosely at his sides. Miles pulled his horse to a sudden stop, his face twisting into an angry scowl when he saw the brown-coated worker blocking his way. He shouted at Liam to move out of the road, calling him a lazy farmhand and threatening to whip him if he did not step aside. Liam did not move an inch, his eyes fixing on his cousin's face with a cold intensity that made the black mare take a nervous step backward. He reached up with a slow, deliberate movement and pulled the gray cap off his head, allowing his long white hair to fall around his pale shoulders. The fog seemed to part slightly around him, the morning light catching the sharp, marble-like angles of his face and the unmistakable look of royal authority in his eyes. Miles froze in his saddle, his mouth opening in terror as he recognized the true face of the king he had planned to cheat. Liam spoke in his true voice, a deep and resonant sound that seemed to vibrate through the damp air of the forest road. He told Miles that he had heard every word of his plan in the tavern the day before, including the scheme to steal the orchard land. He warned his cousin that if he did not leave the valley before the sun reached the top of the mountains, he would have him arrested for bank fraud and stripped of his family name. Miles did not say a word, his face turning as white as the mist, as he turned his horse around and galloped back toward the main highway at full speed. Liam watched him go until the sound of the hooves died away completely, leaving the road quiet once more under the gray sky. He turned and walked back toward the orchard, knowing that the most difficult part of his journey was still waiting for him at the farmhouse. He found Hazel in the garden behind the kitchen, using a small iron knife to cut fresh rosemary branches into a willow basket. She did not look up when he opened the wooden gate, her voice quiet as she noted that her cousin had just been seen riding away from the town in a great hurry. Liam stepped closer to her, his white hair fully visible now in the bright morning light, as he stopped 3 feet away from her basket. He told her that Miles would not be coming back to the valley again, and that her family's debts were no longer a danger to their home. Hazel set her knife down in the dirt and stood up to face him, her gray eyes looking at his white hair and pale skin with a mixture of confusion and sudden realization. She asked him to tell her his true name, her voice flat and cold, in a way that made him feel a deep ache in his chest. He took off his brown wool coat and held it in his hands, feeling the rough fabric that had allowed him to be a regular man for 3 days. He told her his name was Liam, and that he was the king who lived in the stone house on the mountain above her town. He explained how his mother had written to him about her, and how he had used the disguise because he was tired of being hunted by people who only loved his title and his gold. He apologized for the lie, saying it was a coward's choice to enter her home under a false name just to test her honesty. Hazel stood perfectly still among her herb beds, her hands clenching into small fists against the white fabric of her apron. She asked him if he had enjoyed sitting at her table and watching her make a fool of herself while she worried about losing her home to her creditors. She asked if it had amused him to hear her say that the king was a cold monster, while he sat there eating her bread and pretending to be a poor clerk. Liam tried to speak, but she cut him off with a sharp wave of her hand, her gray eyes looking like cold river stones in the morning light. She told him to take his money and his true name and leave her property immediately, saying she would rather see the orchard burn than accept help from a man who used a lie to spy on her. Liam bowed his head, accepting her anger without any excuses, and told her that he had already signed the legal papers to clear her father's bank debts completely. He said the western strip of land was now hers as a legal gift, with no conditions of marriage or payment required from her family. He promised to leave her alone and never return to the farm unless she sent for him herself, walking away down the lane without looking back. Liam spent the next 2 weeks in his high stone house on the hill, refusing to see any visitors or read any of the letters sent by his advisors from the city. He spent his days sitting by the tall windows, looking down at the green valley where the apple trees were starting to turn gold with the arrival of autumn. He missed the smell of the barn, the heavy feel of the wooden fence posts in his hands, and the sound of Hazel's voice correcting his work. He realized that the 3 days he had spent as a simple clerk had been the only time in 7 years that he had felt truly alive. At the end of the 3rd week, a small package arrived at his door, brought by the red-haired farm boy who had looked after his horse in the barn stall. Inside the package was a small glass jar of fresh apple honey and a short note written in a neat, firm hand that he recognized immediately. The note did not ask for forgiveness or contain any sweet words, simply stating that the autumn harvest had begun and the main orchard gate had a broken hinge that required a strong man's hand to fix. It was signed with her name, Hazel, with no titles or formal greetings attached to the bottom. Liam rode down the mountain trail an hour later, wearing his fine blue coat with the silver buttons, but carrying the old gray cap in his leather saddlebag. He found Hazel working under the oldest apple tree in the center of the garden, her apron filled with ripe red fruit that smelled sweet in the crisp air. She looked up when his horse stopped by the wall, her face remaining serious, but her gray eyes softening just a little as she saw him step down from the saddle. Neither of them spoke about the lies or the grand house on the hill, choosing instead to walk down to the broken gate together. They worked for 2 hours in the cool autumn sun, replacing the old iron hinge with a new one that Liam had brought from his own estate workshop. As the sun began to set behind the pine trees, Hazel handed him a fresh apple from her basket, her warm fingers brushing against his cool palm for a brief second. She told him that her father had returned from the city and was very grateful for the cleared debts, though he was still too afraid to speak to a king in person. Liam smiled, taking a bite of the crisp fruit, and said he preferred to be spoken to as a man rather than a king anyway. As the months passed into winter, Liam became a regular sight in the small town of Silver Creek, riding down from his mountain house 3 times every week to help with the winter pruning. He sat at the farmhouse kitchen table with Hazel and her father, eating simple stews and talking about the price of winter wood like an ordinary neighbor. The townspeople slowly stopped bowing when he rode past, learning that the white-haired king was more interested in the health of their crops than the gold in his treasury. In the 3rd month of the winter season, when the ground was covered in a thick layer of white frost, Liam asked Hazel to marry him while they stood under the bare branches of the old apple tree. He did not offer her gold rings or promises of a royal life in a grand city palace, simply holding out his bare hand, palm up, in the cold air between them. Hazel looked at his hand for a long minute, her breath forming small white clouds in front of her face, before sliding her fingers into his grip. She told him she was not promising to be a perfect queen, but she would promise to tell him whenever he was holding the farm tools wrong. The wedding was held in the small wooden church in the center of the town, attended by nothing but the local farmers and the red-haired boy from the barn. A year later, the orchard was heavy with green fruit once more, and the kitchen of the grand stone house on the hill smelled of fresh rosemary and sweet apple pies. The large gray cat had moved up from the valley farm, finding a permanent sleeping spot by the king's heavy stone hearth. Hazel walked through the tall rooms in her simple cotton dresses, refusing to wear the heavy silk gowns his mother sent from the capital. Liam sat at his heavy wooden desk in the evening, watching his wife walk through the garden outside the window as the first night mist began to rise from the creek. He knew their future would not be like the stories told in the old history books, filled with grand balls and perfect royal speeches. They would have difficult seasons when the frost hit the fruit early, and there would be days when his ancient nature felt heavy against her mortal life. But as he looked at her strong shoulders and the steady way she moved through the trees, he felt a deep, quiet certainty that they would face whatever came together on the same ground. The old fatigue was gone from his chest, replaced by the simple peace of a man who had finally found one true thing in a world full of painted smiles.